After my husband died, I paid $300 every month for his loan. But a year later, the bank called. "Ma'am, your husband never had any loan." When I found out where my money had been going, good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Collins. Most people call me Maggie. I am 52 years old, and for 26 of those years I lived in the same cream-colored house on Elmridge Drive in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The maple tree in the front yard, the one Bob planted the spring after our son Danny was born, still turns a deep burning red every October. I used to think that tree was a symbol of something permanent, of roots, of a life built carefully, year by year, with steady hands and patient love. Bob Collins was a good man. I want to say that first, before anything else, because everything that came after could make you doubt it, and I don't think he deserves that doubt. He ran a small hardware store on Granger Avenue that his father had opened in 1971. He coached Danny's Little League team for 4 seasons, even though he had a bad knee. He remembered every anniversary, every birthday, every quiet Tuesday, when I needed flowers for no reason at all. He was not perfect, no one is, but he was mine, and I was his. And for 26 years, that felt like enough. He died on a Wednesday morning in March, a massive heart attack, the doctor said. He was 55 years old, standing in the back room of his store, checking an inventory list. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing left to do. Our daughter Sarah called me from her office in Cincinnati, and I remember sitting down on the kitchen floor because my legs simply stopped working. The maple tree outside was just beginning to bud. I stared at it through the window for a very long time. The months after Bob's death are a blur in my memory. A gray, shapeless stretch of casseroles brought by neighbors, paperwork, condolence cards, the particular cruelty of finding his reading glasses on the nightstand. I kept working through the estate, the store, the accounts, the insurance. I am a part-time bookkeeper by trade, so numbers have never frightened me. But grief has a way of narrowing your focus. You handle the urgent things. You let the rest wait. Bob's sister, Carol, reached out about 3 weeks after the funeral. Carol Henderson. She'd kept her married name for 30 years, was 60 years old, a thin, sharp-featured woman who wore her silver hair in a severe bun and had a talent for making every conversation feel like a negotiation. Her husband, Mike Henderson, worked in commercial real estate and had the handshake of a man who wanted you to know he was important. Bob had been fond of Carol in the way people are fond of difficult relatives, dutifully, carefully, with clear eyes about who she was. Carol came to the house on a Saturday afternoon. She brought a lemon cake and sat at my kitchen table with her hands folded and her voice soft with what I read then as sorrow. "Maggie," she said, "I hate to bring this up so soon, but Bob had borrowed some money from us 3 years ago when the store had that rough patch." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "He was paying it back, $300 a month. There's only about a year left. I just thought you should know so there are no misunderstandings." I looked at the paper. It was handwritten. A simple loan agreement, $5,000, $300 monthly, signed with what looked like Bob's signature. I was sitting in the house where my husband had died 3 weeks earlier. I was not in a state to scrutinize handwriting. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Carol was Bob's sister. The document looked real, and $300 a month felt manageable. A small, concrete grief I could actually do something about. I set up a bank transfer the following Monday. For 12 months, every first of the month, $300 left my account and landed in Carol and Mike Henderson's joint account. I noted it in my ledger and thought nothing more of it. Sometimes grief makes you passive in ways you don't notice until later. The call came on a Thursday in April, 13 months after Bob died. A pleasant woman from the bank's estate services department, her name was Paula, and she had a careful, professional voice, was calling to follow up on the closure of Bob's accounts. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "we've completed our full review of Mr. Collins's financial liabilities as part of the estate process. I just want to confirm, as far as our records show, your husband carried no outstanding personal loans at the time of his death. No third-party lending agreements. His accounts were clean." I held the phone against my ear for a moment without speaking. "No loans?" I repeated. "That's correct, ma'am. Is there something specific you were looking for? I'm happy to help clarify." I told her no. I thanked her. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter very gently, the way you set something down when your hands have started shaking and you don't want to drop it. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Carol had handed me that piece of paper 13 months ago, and I stared at the grain of the wood for a long time. $300 every month for 13 months. Where had my money been going? I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the numbers running through my head in neat, merciless columns, the way numbers always do when you've spent 20 years working as a bookkeeper. $300 times 13 months. $3,900. I had paid Carol and Mike Henderson $3,900 out of my widow's budget, out of the money I was carefully managing while I figured out what my life looked like now that Bob was gone. $3,900. I got up at 4 in the morning and went to my home office, a small room off the hallway that used to be Danny's bedroom before he moved to Portland. I turned on the desk lamp and sat down in front of the filing cabinet. I am a methodical person. Bob used to tease me about it. The labeled folders, the color-coded tabs, the way I kept every receipt for anything over $20. That methodical nature had felt like a small thing for most of my life. That night, it felt like armor. I pulled out every file related to Bob's finances, the store accounts, the personal checking, the savings, the insurance documents, everything I had gathered during the estate process. I looked for any record that Bob had borrowed $5,000 from Carol and Mike Henderson 3 years ago. A wire transfer, a check, a deposit into his personal account or the store account that coincided with that amount. I went back 4 years to be thorough. There was nothing. Not a single transaction that suggested $5,000 had come from Carol and Mike at any point in the last decade. I cross-referenced with Bob's store accounts. He had, in fact, experienced a rough quarter in late 2021, but he had covered the gap with a small business line of credit from the bank, which I found documented clearly in the files. He had paid that line of credit off himself on schedule by the following spring. He had not borrowed money from his sister. I sat back in the chair. The desk lamp cast a yellow circle of light over the papers, and the room beyond was dark and very quiet. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere down the street. I thought about Carol at my kitchen table with her lemon cake and her soft voice and her folded hands. I thought about how carefully I had been grieving, how open I had been, how completely unguarded, and I felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, not like a crack or an explosion, but slowly like a foundation settling. The fear came first. I want to be honest about that. It sat in my chest like a stone, the fear of being wrong, of accusing family, of making a terrible mistake and destroying what was left of my connection to Bob's side of the family. Carol was Bob's sister. What if I had missed something? What if there was an account I hadn't found? But I am a bookkeeper. I do not miss accounts. The second thing I felt, underneath the fear, was anger. A quiet, focused anger that I recognized as more useful than the fear. Bob had died and left me in this house with this maple tree and these careful files, and 30 years of a life we had built together. And someone, family, had looked at my grief and seen an opportunity. Was I going to let that stand? I spent the rest of the morning making a list, not an emotional list, a practical one. 3 columns. What I knew, what I needed to verify, what I needed to do. What I knew. The bank had confirmed no outstanding loans. My own records showed no incoming transfer from Carol and Mike. I had paid $3,900 over 13 months. I had a handwritten document that Carol had presented as a loan agreement. What I needed to verify, the authenticity of that document. Whether Bob's signature on it matched his actual signature. Whether Carol and Mike had any documentation of the original transfer, a canceled check, a wire confirmation, anything. What I needed to do, consult someone with legal knowledge before I said a single word to Carol or Mike. I understood instinctively that the moment I confronted them directly, they would have time to prepare. I needed to be prepared first. I also needed to look more carefully through Bob's personal papers. He had kept a home filing system separate from the store, an old green ledger book and the accordion folder of personal records that I had not yet fully sorted through. In the weeks after his death, I had taken the documents I needed for the estate and set the rest aside for later. Later had apparently arrived. I found the accordion folder in the closet of my home office behind a box of holiday cards. I opened it on the desk and began going through it page by page. It took me 40 minutes to find what I was looking for. In a pocket near the back, folded in thirds, was a sheet of Bob's personal stationery. His handwriting. I knew his handwriting the way I knew his voice, the way I knew the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. It was a personal note, not a formal document, dated April of 2020. It read, "Lent Carol and Mike $8,000 for the basement flood repairs. Mike said they'd pay it back when the insurance settled. Still waiting." Below that, in smaller writing, undated but clearly added later, "Going on 2 years. They haven't mentioned it. I don't know how to bring it up." I held that piece of paper in both hands and read it 3 times. Bob had lent Carol and Mike $8,000. They had never paid him back. And after he died, they had fabricated a loan agreement claiming the opposite, that he had owed them and had been collecting $300 a month from his widow for over a year. My hands were completely steady. The anger had stopped being quiet. I had my plan. The law office of Patricia Walsh was on the 4th floor of a building on High Street, downtown Columbus. I had found her name through a referral from my friend Diane, who had used her during her own divorce 3 years ago. "She's the kind of woman who doesn't waste words," Diane had told me. That was exactly what I needed. Patricia Walsh was in her mid-50s, with short gray hair and reading glasses that she wore on a chain. She had the calm, organized manner of someone who had heard every possible variety of human betrayal and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday morning and laid out everything I had: the bank statement, my own financial records, the handwritten loan agreement Carol had given me, and Bob's personal note from the accordion folder. She read through everything without speaking. Then she set the papers down and looked at me over her glasses. "Tell me about the signature on this loan agreement," she said. "It doesn't look right," I said. Bob's handwriting had a very specific way of forming the capital CE. He always looped it at the bottom. The C in Collins on that document doesn't loop. I've been looking at his signature for 26 years. Patricia nodded slowly. That observation alone isn't proof of forgery, but it's the beginning of an argument. She tapped Bob's personal note. This, however, is potentially significant. It establishes a prior financial relationship in which your husband was the creditor, not the debtor. Combined with the absence of any transfer record and the bank's confirmation of no outstanding loans, you have a circumstantial case, possibly more. What would make it more? I asked. Document analysis of the signature and Carol Henderson's own records, specifically any proof she has of the alleged original transfer. If she cannot produce a canceled check or a wire confirmation showing $5,000 left her account and entered Bob's, that's a serious problem for her story. Patricia paused. "Mrs. Collins, I have to ask you directly. Are you prepared for what this may become? If there's forgery involved, this isn't just a civil dispute. It could become a criminal matter. I thought about Carol at my kitchen table with the lemon cake. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. We agreed on a plan. Patricia would send a formal letter to Carol and Mike, not accusatory, not aggressive, simply requesting documentation of the original loan transfer as part of a routine review of Bob's estate. A legitimate, reasonable request that no innocent party would have reason to refuse. It would tell us everything we needed to know by how they responded. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Carol would sense that something had changed. The letter went out on Thursday. By Saturday morning, I had a text from Carol that read, "Maggie, are you having someone look through Bob's financial records? I just want to understand if there's an issue I should know about." The message had the particular, careful tone of someone trying to sound unconcerned while absolutely being concerned. I did not respond. Patricia had advised me to route all communication through her office for the time being. I set the phone face down on the counter and went back to sorting through the rest of Bob's accordion folder. That was when I found the second document. It was tucked behind a folder of old tax returns, a photocopy of a check dated June 2020, Bob's check, drawn on his personal account, made out to Carol and Michael Henderson. The amount was $8,000. In the memo line, Bob had written, "Basement flood repairs. To be repaid." I sat on the floor of my office and held the photocopy in both hands. Bob had kept a copy of the check. Of course he had. He was married to a bookkeeper for 26 years. Some habits transfer. He had kept the copy and written the note and put them both in the back of an accordion folder because he didn't know how to bring up the repayment without making things awkward at Christmas. And Carol had known that check existed. She had known that Bob had documentation. She had waited until he was dead, until the only person who could contradict her story was gone. And then she had walked into my kitchen with a lemon cake and a forged piece of paper. The floor was cold. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. I thought about the 13 months of $300 transfers. I thought about Bob writing, still waiting in small handwriting on a piece of personal stationery, and then putting it away because he didn't want to cause trouble. I photographed the check copy with my phone and emailed it to Patricia Walsh within the hour. Her reply came back in 15 minutes. This changes the picture considerably. We are no longer dealing with a disputed debt. We are dealing with fraud. Patricia filed the formal complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office on a Friday afternoon in late May. She also filed a civil suit on my behalf. Fraud, unjust enrichment, and breach of fiduciary duty, given the family relationship. The complaint was accompanied by the bank's written confirmation of no outstanding loans, my complete transfer records showing $3,900 paid to Carol and Mike, Bob's personal note documenting the $8,000 loan he had made to them, and the photocopy of the original check. Patricia had also engaged a forensic document examiner, a retired FBI analyst named Dr. Stephen Marsh, to evaluate the signature on Carol's loan agreement. His preliminary assessment came back within 10 days. The signature showed significant inconsistencies with exemplars of Robert Collins' known signature. His full report would take another 3 weeks, but the preliminary finding was enough. I remember the morning the complaint was filed. I drove downtown with Patricia, sat in a chair outside an office that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and signed my name to the relevant documents. My hand was steady. My heart was steady. I thought, Bob kept that check copy. He kept it because somewhere, underneath his desire to keep the peace, he knew. That thought steadied me more than anything else. Carol found out by the following Tuesday. I don't know exactly how, whether she was served formally or whether she heard through some channel I wasn't aware of. What I know is that she appeared on my doorstep at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening, and she was not carrying a lemon cake. I saw her through the window before I opened the door. She was standing with her arms crossed, and Mike was behind her, and the set of her shoulders told me everything about what kind of conversation this was going to be. I opened the door and stood in the doorway without inviting them in. Maggie. Carol's voice had lost its careful softness. It was sharp now, stripped down to its actual texture. Do you have any idea what you've done? You filed a legal complaint against your husband's family. Bob would be horrified. Come inside if you want to talk, I said, but I should tell you that anything you say may need to be shared with my attorney. Mike stepped forward. He was a broad man, and he used his size the way some people do, as a conversational tool. This is insane, Maggie. We are family. Bob borrowed that money. We have documentation. Your documentation doesn't include a bank record of the transfer, I said. You had $5,000 leave your account and arrive in Bob's. Where's that record? We paid him in cash, Mike said. I looked at him for a moment. Cash, I repeated. People do that in family situations, Carol said quickly. It was informal. We trusted each other. And yet you had him sign a formal agreement, I said. There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that told me they had not thought that particular sequence through carefully enough. This is going to get ugly, Mike said, and his voice had dropped into a register that was meant to sound like a warning. You want to drag Bob's name through a legal proceeding? You want his kids reading about this in court documents? Think about what you're doing to this family. I felt something cold move through me. Not fear, or not only fear. It was the recognition of a threat being delivered by someone who believed it would work. They were counting on my grief, my loyalty to Bob's memory, my desire to protect my children from unpleasantness. They had counted on all of that for 13 months, and it had worked perfectly. I think you should speak with an attorney, I said. I don't have anything else to say to you tonight. I closed the door. I locked it. Then I stood in my front hallway for about 30 seconds, with my back against the door and my eyes closed. Through the door, I could hear Mike saying something, low, tight words that I couldn't make out, and then the sound of their car starting. I called Patricia Walsh and told her about the visit. She noted it, told me not to engage with them further, and reminded me that any contact they initiated could itself become relevant to the case. After I hung up, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my daughter Sarah and told her what was happening, all of it. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" And there was something in her voice that broke open a space I had been keeping sealed for over a year. I needed to be sure first, I said. Are you sure now? Yes, I said. I'm completely sure. The following weekend, I drove to Sarah's apartment in Cincinnati and spent 3 days there. We cooked together and watched old movies and walked along the river in the evenings. I didn't think about Carol and Mike for most of that time. I thought about Bob, the good version, the real version, and about the maple tree, and about the patient work of putting a life back together. I needed those 3 days. What was coming required everything I had. 2 weeks after the doorstep confrontation, Carol called me. Not from her own number, from a number I didn't recognize, which I only answered because it had a Columbus area code and I was half expecting a call from Patricia's office. Maggie. Her voice was different again, softer. The negotiating voice. The lemon cake voice. I know things have gotten complicated. I've been thinking about it, and I think we started this conversation on the wrong foot. Mike and I, we miss Bob too. This has all been so painful. I was standing in my kitchen. Through the window, I could see the maple tree, small new leaves catching the afternoon light. I let the silence sit for a moment before I spoke. Carol, I said, I'm not able to discuss the matter with you directly. You're welcome to contact Patricia Walsh. Patricia Walsh is a lawyer, Maggie. This is family. A pause. Look, what if we just returned what you paid? The $3,900. We return it, you drop the suit, and we move on. For Bob's sake. For Bob's sake. I noticed something in that moment. The offer itself, returning the $3,900, confirmed that they knew the money was mine. No one offers to return a legitimate debt repayment. You don't give back money that was owed to you. The offer was an implicit admission, and Carol, in her urgency to make the problem disappear, had not thought that through. I appreciate you reaching out, I said. Please contact Patricia Walsh. I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, and I felt, I want to describe this accurately, a kind of cold clarity, not triumph, not even relief. Just the very clean feeling of knowing exactly where you stand and choosing not to move. I called Diane. Diane Foster had been my best friend since our daughters were in kindergarten together. She was a small, practical woman who worked as a hospital administrator and had seen enough human behavior in that job to be permanently unsurprised by most things. I told her about Carol's call. I told her about the offer. She offered to return the money, Diane said. Yes. And you said no. I said, talk to my lawyer. There was a brief pause. Good, Diane said, because this isn't about the $3,900 anymore, is it? No, I said. It's about the $8,000 Bob lent them that they never paid back. It's about the forged signature. It's about 13 months of looking at my bank account and feeling like I was doing the right thing while they were laughing. Right, Diane said. So what do you need? That was Diane's gift. She never asked how you were feeling when what she meant was, what do you need? She skipped the soft layer and went straight to the useful thing. What I needed, it turned out, was someone to have coffee with me 3 times a week and talk about something else entirely. What I needed was to walk with her in the evenings along the park path near her house and let my nervous system believe that the world was still ordinarily itself. What I needed was to not be alone in the waiting, because waiting, it turns out, is the hardest part of any fight. The action feels purposeful. The waiting feels like standing in an open field. Diane gave me all of that. She came to my house and we made soup, and she told me about the ridiculous politics of the hospital's new electronic record system. She did not treat me as fragile. She treated me as a woman who was doing a difficult thing carefully and would come out the other side of it intact. That treatment, offered consistently and without drama, was worth more than I can explain. Dr. Marsh's full forensic report arrived at Patricia's office during that period. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on Carol's loan agreement was not consistent with Robert Collins' authenticated signature in any of the 15 comparison documents examined. The report used the phrase, highly probable forgery. Patricia forwarded it to me with a single line, "We have what we need." Carol and Mike had gone quiet after the phone call. They were regrouping, Patricia said, consulting their own counsel, presumably, understanding that the offer hadn't worked, deciding what to do next. I gave myself permission to feel the fear when it came. And it did come, usually at night, usually in the form of lying awake running scenarios. What if their attorney found some angle I hadn't thought of? What if it came down to a he said she said with no clear resolution? What if the trial was long and expensive and exhausting, and at the end of it, the damage to my family was worse than what I'd already suffered? Then I would turn on the lamp and open my notepad and look at the list of what I had. The bank statement, the transfer records, Bob's note, the check copy, the forensic report, and I would think, you have more than you need. Hold the line. I held the line. They came in June, on a Sunday afternoon. I saw Mike's silver SUV pull into the driveway from the upstairs window where I was sorting through a box of Bob's old books. I had time to take a breath before I went downstairs. I opened the door before they could knock. Carol was dressed carefully, a pale blue blouse, pearl earrings, the kind of outfit she wore to things she wanted to control. Mike stood slightly behind her with his hands in his pockets, which for him was the equivalent of projecting warmth. "We're not here to fight," Carol said immediately. "We just want to talk, as family." I stepped back and let them into the living room. I did not offer coffee. We sat down, Carol and Mike on the sofa, me in the armchair across from them with my back straight and my hands in my lap. The room was quiet. Outside, a lawnmower was running somewhere down the block. "Maggie," Carol started, her voice low and careful. "I know things have gotten out of hand. Lawyers, documents. This isn't what any of us wanted. Bob would be heartbroken." "You've mentioned Bob's feelings before," I said. "I'd like to hear about yours." She blinked, slightly thrown by the directness. "My feelings are that this family is being torn apart over a misunderstanding. Bob was forgetful sometimes. Maybe the records got confused. Maybe he just didn't note things down properly. You know how he could be." "Bob kept meticulous records," I said. "I was his bookkeeper for 20 years. Mike shifted on the sofa. "Look, Maggie, let's be practical here. You have a legal case that's going to cost you thousands in attorney fees, drag on for a year or more, and put everything about your family in a public court record. Danny and Sarah are going to read depositions. Is that what you want for them?" Danny and Sarah. There it was, the real instrument of pressure. They had held it back for this visit, saved it for the moment they thought I might be softening. "What do you want?" I asked. Carol leaned forward. "We want to resolve this quietly. We'll return the payments, the full $3,900. We'll call it even, walk away, and none of this goes any further. Maggie, think about your children. Think about the holidays. Think about what Bob built." I looked at her for a moment, at the pearl earrings and the pale blue blouse, at Mike with his practiced, reasonable expression. I thought about Bob's note. Going on 2 years. They haven't mentioned it. I don't know how to bring it up. "Carol," I said, "Bob lent you $8,000 in 2020. I have the check copy. You never paid him back. Then you forged his signature on a loan agreement and collected $3,900 from me while I was grieving. A forensic examiner has confirmed the signature is not Bob's." The room went very still. "That's an extraordinary accusation," Mike said, but his voice had changed register. "I'm not making an accusation," I said. "I'm describing what the documents show. The complaint is already filed. The forensic report is already in the prosecutor's hands. This conversation isn't going to change that." Carol's composure slipped. It was subtle. A tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of her mouth. But I had been watching her face for 26 years, across holiday tables, and I saw it clearly. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said. Her voice had gone cold and thin. "You think you have everything figured out. You think you have all your little papers and your little reports and you know the whole story. You don't know anything." "Then tell me what I'm missing," I said. She didn't answer. Mike stood up first and Carol followed, and the shift in the room was immediate and absolute. The performance of reasonableness abandoned, the mask dropped, and what was left was simply two people who had made a calculated bet on a grieving woman's compliance and had discovered, too late, that the bet was wrong. "This will not end the way you think it will," Mike said from the doorway. I didn't stand up. I stayed in my armchair with my hands in my lap, and I looked at him steadily, and I said nothing. They left. The SUV backed out of the driveway. The lawnmower was still running down the street, the most ordinary sound in the world. I sat in the living room for a few minutes after they were gone. My heart was beating hard. That is the thing no one tells you about confrontation. Even when you're prepared, even when you're right, even when you've done everything correctly, your body still behaves as though you are in danger. The fear was real. My hands were cold, but I noticed something underneath the fear. It was not shaking me loose from my purpose. It was doing the opposite. Every threat Mike had delivered, every manipulation Carol had attempted, every time they had invoked Bob's name to try to make me stand down, each of those things had added weight to what I was doing, not subtracted from it. I picked up my phone and called Patricia Walsh. "They came to the house," I said. "What did they say?" I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. "Good," she said when I was finished. "That visit may be useful. Documenting contact after legal proceedings have been initiated has its own implications. Write everything down tonight. Times, exact words, who stood where." I spent that evening writing 3 pages of notes, and then I made tea and sat under the lamp and read a novel for an hour, because I had learned by then that the work is one thing and the self is another, and you have to tend to both. The hearing was held on a Thursday in September in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Courthouse. It was not a full trial. This was a civil hearing with the criminal referral proceeding in parallel, and the purpose of this session was to review the evidence and determine whether the case warranted further civil judgment. Patricia had prepared meticulously. I had been over every document so many times that the pages had started to feel like furniture, familiar and unremarkable. I wore a gray dress and low heels, and I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands folded and my face composed. Sarah had driven up from Cincinnati the night before and was sitting in the gallery behind me. She had offered to hold my hand that morning, and I had held it for about 10 seconds in the parking lot and then let go, because I needed to walk into that building as myself, not as someone being steadied. Carol and Mike were at the defendant's table with their attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the look of someone who charged a great deal per hour and was not entirely comfortable with the strength of his client's position. He had made several pre-trial motions to exclude the forensic report, all of which had been denied. Patricia presented the case in her characteristic way, methodically, without drama, letting the documents do the weight of the work. The bank statement, the transfer records, Bob's personal note, authenticated and dated, the check copy, the forensic report from Dr. Marsh. Gerald Fitch's strategy, it emerged, was to argue that the loan agreement was genuine, that Bob had simply been informal about the transaction, and that Maggie's interpretation of Bob's personal note was subjective. He put Carol on the stand. Carol was composed. I'll give her that. She had prepared. She spoke in the soft, careful voice, described the loan as a private family matter, said she and Mike had given Bob cash, said the note in the accordion folder was simply Bob's habit of writing reminders to himself, and didn't mean what I thought it meant. Then Patricia stood up. The first question she asked was quiet and simple. "Mrs. Henderson, you testified that you gave your brother $5,000 in cash in the fall of 2021. Can you tell us where that cash came from?" Carol said it came from their savings. "Your personal savings account?" "Yes." Patricia introduced a bank statement. Carol and Mike Henderson's joint savings account, October 2021. The balance at the start of that month was approximately $11,000. The balance at the end was approximately $11,000. No cash withdrawal of $5,000. No withdrawal of any kind over $500. Carol said they had kept some cash at home. Patricia introduced the next document, a financial statement Carol and Mike had submitted to a mortgage refinancing application in August 2021, in which they had disclosed all liquid assets. There was no mention of cash holdings. There was, in fact, a note on the application indicating they were drawing down savings due to a basement flood repair bill. The basement flood. The same basement flood Bob had paid for. I watched Carol's face across the courtroom as Patricia laid out the sequence. It was like watching a person in a glass room realize that the glass was transparent. The composure didn't shatter. Carol was not a person who shattered easily, but it contracted. It pulled inward. The space between her eyes tightened. Gerald Fitch objected several times. The judge, a compact, efficient woman named Judge Abernathy, overruled each objection with a single word. Then Patricia put Dr. Marsh on the stand. He was 63 years old with the relaxed authority of someone who had testified in federal court many times and was not impressed by the theater of smaller proceedings. He walked through his methodology, the 15 comparison documents, the specific letter formations he had analyzed, the inconsistencies he had found. He used a screen at the front of the courtroom to show the comparisons side by side. The courtroom was very quiet. Gerald Fitch cross-examined him for 35 minutes and succeeded in establishing only that document analysis is not a perfect science, which Dr. Marsh agreed with cheerfully and then spent 5 minutes explaining why his conclusion remained unchanged. I kept my eyes on my own hands during most of the testimony. I had heard all of this. I did not need to watch it unfold. What I was aware of at the edge of my attention was Mike at the defendant's table. He had started the morning with the posture of a man who believed he was going to win. By early afternoon, the posture had changed. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands over his mouth. At one point, he leaned over and said something quietly to Gerald Fitch, and Fitch shook his head slightly. The final piece of testimony was mine. Patricia walked me through everything: my marriage, Bob's death, Carol's visit to my kitchen, the transfer setup, the bank call, the search through Bob's papers. I kept my voice level and my account precise. I did not editorialize. I did not cry, though I came close once, when I described finding Bob's note in the accordion folder, the part where he wrote, "I don't know how to bring it up." That was the part that still got me, not the fraud. The fact that Bob had been carrying this small, private frustration in silence because he loved the peace of the family more than he needed to be repaid. When Carol took the stand again for redirect, something had changed in her. The careful composure had developed visible fault lines. She answered questions a beat too slowly. She repeated herself once and had to be redirected by her own attorney. When Patricia asked her directly, "Mrs. Henderson, did you forge your brother's signature on this document?" Carol said, "Absolutely not," in a voice that was just slightly too loud for a courtroom. Judge Abernathy made a note. Judge Abernathy delivered her ruling 3 weeks after the hearing in a written decision that Patricia sent to me as a PDF. I read it at my kitchen table on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, with a cup of coffee and the maple tree blazing red outside the window. The ruling was 12 pages. I read every word. The judge found in my favor on all civil counts. Fraud was established. Unjust enrichment was established. The loan agreement was found to be invalid. The judge did not use the word forged in the civil ruling, deferring to the ongoing criminal matter, but she noted that the document could not be relied upon as an authentic instrument and gave it no legal weight. The forensic evidence was cited. The bank records were cited. Bob's personal note and the check copy were cited. The civil judgment was as follows. Carol and Mike Henderson were ordered to return the $3,900 I had paid in fraudulent loan repayments. They were ordered to pay the outstanding $8,000 that they had owed Bob, and which now formed part of his estate and, by inheritance, came to me. They were ordered to pay my legal fees, which by that point amounted to just over $12,000, and they were assessed punitive damages of $10,000 in recognition of the deliberate and premeditated nature of the fraud and the particular circumstances. A widow, grieving, exploited by a family member, total $33,900. Patricia called me 20 minutes after she sent the PDF. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Quiet," I said, and it was true. I felt very quiet. The criminal matter proceeded separately. The prosecutor's office had been building its case in parallel, using the civil proceedings evidence as a foundation. In November, 2 months after the civil ruling, Carol and Mike Henderson were charged with 1 count each of fraud and 1 count of forgery. Given their age and absence of prior criminal record, the criminal process moved toward a negotiated resolution. They pleaded guilty to a single count of fraud, avoiding trial. The penalties included a criminal record, probation, community service, and a requirement to complete the full civil judgment payment. What the plea agreement could not give me, and what I had not expected to want, was a public acknowledgement. But in the courtroom where the plea was entered, Carol had to state, for the record, that she had deceived her sister-in-law. She had to say that the loan agreement was not genuine. She had to say she had received money she was not entitled to. I sat in the gallery with Sarah on one side and Diane on the other. Carol did not look at me when she made her statement. She stared at a spot on the wall slightly above the judge's head, and she said the words in a flat, diminished voice, and the court recorder typed them into the official record. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no crack of thunder, no cinematic collapse. It was a small, formal, institutional act, but it was real, and it was permanent, and no one could take it back. After the plea was entered and the courtroom began to empty, Sarah slid her arm through mine. "Are you okay, Mom?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. We walked out of the courthouse into a November afternoon, gray sky, bare trees, the smell of cold air. Diane was on my other side and she said, "I think someone owes you a very good lunch." And somehow that ordinary sentence, its absolute normalcy, its small domestic kindness, was exactly right. We went to a restaurant downtown that had booths and good soup. We sat for 2 hours. We talked about Sarah's new apartment and Diane's hospital's new electronic record system, which was apparently still terrible, and a novel I had just finished that I wanted to recommend to both of them. We talked about Bob, too, the good version, the real version, the man who planted the maple tree and coached Little League and remembered every Tuesday when I needed flowers for no reason. We did not talk about Carol and Mike Henderson. There was nothing left to say about them. The first payment arrived from their attorney in December, a partial disbursement per the payment schedule their counsel had arranged. I deposited it without ceremony. I noted it in my ledger, in my careful, methodical handwriting, in a column I had labeled Resolved. That column was, by then, one of my favorite things. Spring came back to Elmridge Drive, and with it the maple tree. The same patient, reliable maple tree, burning green this time instead of red, pushing out leaves with the indifferent confidence of something that has survived many winters. I stood on the front porch with my coffee one morning in April and watched a robin work at the grass near the roots, and I thought about how much had changed and how much had stayed exactly the same. The house felt mine now in a different, more intentional way. I had repainted the kitchen a pale sage green over the winter. I had bought a new reading chair for the office, the right size, the right lamp, calibrated to what I wanted rather than what had accumulated by habit. Small changes, the kind that add up. My finances, for the first time since Bob's death, were genuinely stable. The civil judgment, fully paid out over 6 months per the court-approved schedule, had resolved the estate's outstanding debts, covered my legal fees, and left me with a meaningful cushion. I worked with a financial advisor named Loretta to plan what came next. For the first time in 30 years, I was managing my own money entirely alone, and I was good at it. I had always been good at it. I had just never had to prove it to myself before. I started working full-time again in January. A small accounting firm downtown needed a senior bookkeeper, and I was exactly that. I drove into Columbus on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and worked from home the other days. Having structure back in the week was something I had missed more than I realized. Sarah came up from Cincinnati most months. Danny flew in from Portland for 2 weeks in August, and we painted the back bedroom together and argued companionably about color and settled on a blue-gray that turned out to be exactly right. On the second evening, Danny told me he'd been worried about me for 2 years. I told him that was fair and that he didn't need to worry anymore. He looked at me, that careful, assessing look so much like Bob's, and nodded. Diane and I walked the park path on Wednesday evenings when the weather allowed and talked on the phone for an hour while we made dinner in our own kitchens on the evenings it didn't. This arrangement had emerged during the worst of the legal process and simply continued because it turned out we had both wanted exactly this for years. I thought about Bob often, but the thoughts had changed quality. Moved from the sharp, raw edge of early grief towards something more like a conversation, like he was still occupying a room in the house that I walked through every day. As for Carol and Mike Henderson, the criminal conviction carried consequences they had apparently not fully reckoned with. Mike's career in commercial real estate depends substantially on professional reputation, and the public record said something specific about his. 2 business relationships ended in the spring. A third partnership, held for 9 years, dissolved in June. Carol resigned from her part-time position at a nonprofit in January. Their house, the house with the basement that Bob had paid to repair, went on the market in February. They were downsizing, moving somewhere smaller, starting over in a diminished configuration. I did not feel triumphant when I heard any of this. What Carol and Mike had done was calculated and cruel. What happened to them afterward was the natural consequence of those choices. The justice system had done what it was designed to do. What I felt when I let myself feel it was simply relief. Relief that I had not let fear stop me, and that Bob's $8,000 had been acknowledged, made real in the public record, returned. He deserved that. On a Saturday afternoon in late May, I drove to the cemetery where Bob is buried. I brought yellow tulips from the garden and a copy of the final civil judgment, the last page, with the total amount listed and the word resolved stamped in red. I put the tulips in the holder by the stone. I folded the judgment into quarters and left it under the vase. "I found the check copy," I said out loud. "I handled it. You can stop waiting." The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the trees at the edge of the cemetery, a bird was working through a complicated, unhurried song. I drove home. The maple tree was full and green and entirely itself. I made dinner, called Diane, read 60 pages of a novel I was enjoying, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. That is what winning looks like, in real life. Not a parade, just a Tuesday that is genuinely okay, and the knowledge that you earned it. For a long time after Bob died, I thought grief meant accepting whatever came. I was wrong. Grief is not passivity. The people who loved you deserve to be protected. Their memory, their legacy, their truth. What Carol and Mike counted on was my exhaustion. What they didn't count on was that I had spent 26 years being careful, and careful people keep records. Here's what I learned. Kindness is not the same as compliance. Family is not immunity from accountability. And a woman who knows how to read a ledger is a very dangerous thing to lie to. What would you have done in my place? Would you have accepted the offer? Would you have stayed quiet for the sake of peace? I would love to know. Leave a comment below. I read everyone. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And thank you, truly, for being here and for listening all the way to the end. Maggie Collins, Columbus, Ohio.